Bulwark Studios and Kasedo Games are steadily working on Warhammer 40K Mechanicus 2, and recently they've released a public demo on Steam which I spent a few hours with. Now I have some thoughts on the gameplay and where the game is headed, so I thought this would be the perfect time to make a video about it and discuss some of the significant gameplay changes you'll encounter, as well as why I think this sequel has the potential to be a frequent pick in your game's library. For those unfamiliar with Mechanicus 1, here's a quick summary. It's a turn-based tactics game set in the Warhammer 40K universe from Games Workshop. You command a small team of tech priests from the Adeptus Mechanicus faction who have stumbled upon a Necron tomb and are ultimately attempting to prevent the Necrons from fully awakening, spreading death and chaos across the universe. Now, with each mission played, the tomb awakens further and further, and when the meter fills to 100%, you are confronted with the final mission, during which you have to defeat a few Necron lords, and you win or lose the game depending on how well you manage to prepare your team. Throughout the game, you'll find new weapons and resources to upgrade your tech priests through tech trees, each catering to a specific playstyle. Since you had multiple priests in your team, it was quite possible to mix them up to create a diverse team, although there were a few builds that were pretty OP. So that's something that's being addressed in Mechanicus 2, but more on that later. Switching back to part 2, it's a continuation of this general design, but with some important differences. For starters, the focus during and outside of missions is no longer on directing and developing random tech priests, but instead you control the higher ranking tech priest from the storyline of the first game. During missions, this means your team will consist of one of these leaders, supplemented by a number of supporting units from the faction's ranks. This immediately makes the game feel different when playing the demo. Previously, you could afford to lose a tech priest as you went along, but now you have to pay more attention to using and protecting your one leader. Also, you now make more intensive use of your support units. The available range of these support units has been extended significantly. While in Mechanicus 1 there were only a handful of different units, Bulwark has brought almost the entire range of the faction's tabletop army to the game in part 2, and these now also have their own customization options. That's something players may have missed in the first game, because you would be able to customize, of course, your tech priests, but not servitors or skitari. You would, however, be able to unlock a higher level version of those support units with improved stats and maybe an additional trait, but not in the same way as you would the priests. Since managing a team of customizable priests is therefore no longer present, and the fun of working on the synergy of their builds is kinda lost, the ability to customize all support units might be a nice way to fill this in. Who knows, but we'll have to wait for further details to be released on this to see how much of an impact this actually has on the way how the game feels in comparison to part 1. But aside from units, especially the planning of your actions during missions has undergone a series of small, but I think altogether far-reaching changes that can really turn tactics upside down. And I might have to add, as opposed to how you would be playing Mechanicus 1, where previously your units and those of the enemy were placed in a clear queue in a sequence. This now has been replaced by a system with more flexibility. You currently cannot see which unit of your opponent is where in the turn order. This only becomes visible when a unit has attacked or has been attacked. In addition, your own units no longer move in a fixed order, but you can choose which one to use when it's your turn, as long as that unit hasn't been used earlier this round, which is much like how the tabletop works. I have to say, it took me a little while to get used to this, but you'll soon notice that it offers more tactical choices in a round by going through the row of units in an order that's most advantageous to you. Another major change is the principle of movement and shooting. In the first game, by cleverly using cognition points, you could traverse almost the entire map with a single tech priest, scanning and blowing up terminals along the way. That's very different in part 2, where units can no longer move once they fired a weapon, unless that weapon was assault class. Now this creates a totally different tactical consideration from one round to the next. At least I think so, because I often encountered situations in part 1 where I wanted to fire with everything my priest had before seeking cover or moving elsewhere. Another detail is that weapons no longer have a machine spirit system, but rather utilize various traits designed to make their deployment tactically interesting. These traits grant a certain effect when conditions are met, such as dealing more damage when the unit hasn't moved, or dealing extra damage when you're within a certain distance from the unit you want to target. Now, my guess is that the machine spirit idea was replaced because it was highly exploitable with certain builds and they could do massive amounts of damage within one turn. Now, with these traits, the RNG effect is a bit smaller, and this will also help the developers with balance. And just for a small sidetrack, another interesting little detail from the demo that I found is that Faustinius can even use his pistol at melee range, something that wasn't possible before. Now, you might say that doesn't seem like such a big deal, but in tactical situations where every point of damage can make the difference between winning and losing a leader once you've passed a turn, this change might be a game changer, especially when you're playing with Iron Man mode or permadeath enabled. The settings have been given at least one major quality of life feature regarding something you might have heard about if you've played part 1 before, which is combat animation speed. Necrons, for example, aren't the fastest guys, and their slow movements convey a lore-bound sense of menace as the unstoppable killer robot. But I think some players just prefer to focus more on performing actions and the combat itself, where they want to see an immediate result of their action instead of waiting for animations. So this setting will definitely offer them a solution with up to 300% faster gameplay. An integral part of combat, especially in the mid to late game, is planning out your moves by managing your cognition points. Now, the demo doesn't show us many details about this, and I can only say more about the gameplay in a full review, but from what I've heard from Kasedo Games at Gamescom, the cognition system has been thoroughly revised to give players a better experience in acquiring cognition points, thus ensuring a smoother gameplay experience. What I found to be noteworthy in the demo is that it shows a full cognition bar of 10 points. Now, I don't know if this was done for the demo, so players would have a chance to fiddle around with, various abilities every turn, instead of having to skip a couple of turns because you wouldn't have any cognition points available to fire certain weapons. But in part 1, you started with 4 points and you had to unlock the rest one by one as mission rewards. But I'm very curious to see what this system will ultimately look like in part 2. I think it's obvious by now Bulwark hasn't shied away from revising and tackling a lot of systems, but I haven't mentioned one of the biggest changes yet. In addition to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Necrons are now also a playable race. The demo gives you a small taste of their gameplay, and I think it was a stroke of genius in the design because, let's face it, who doesn't love Necrons? And for those who played part 1, who hasn't thought at least once, how cool would it be to be able to play Necrons? And when I give in to some good old-fashioned wild speculation, how cool would it be if this opens the door to other playable factions? But wishful thinking aside, the Necrons have their own distinct profile with its own version of cognition points called the Dominion system. In keeping with the Necrons' design, the more this meter fills, the further the Necrons awaken, so to speak, and the more powerful they become. For each point of damage you deal, you gain 1 Dominion point. When the meter is full, you'll gain a Dominion level, and over time, as you gain more levels, the effects of Necron weapons and skills will become increasingly stronger. Necrons have received just as much time and attention during development as the Mechanicus, so you have a very extensive range of units at your disposal, but they are structured slightly different. Same as with the Mechanicus, you can choose from different Necron lords as your leader, and each lord has his or her own court of supporting units, which can also be tweaked. Now, this gives each leader a rather unique playstyle, and you can also tailor their abilities to suit. This brings me to the features we don't see in the demo but will be present in the full release. The combat missions are, of course, the tactical part, but players also spent countless hours in part 1 working on their priest builds. The system returns in part 2, but like I said, from the perspective of the leaders and support units instead of a team of priests, but it's also been significantly overhauled. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of this, only some screenshots from the press kit, but you can clearly see here that there are countless options to try, and one of the coolest details is that you can respec the builds in Mechanicus 2 for free. In part 1 you'd spend your Blackstone to unlock a new tier within one of the skill trees, but after that you were committed. So being able to respec these abilities how you want, when you want, just adds a lot of flexibility and is extremely player friendly. And I think this slightly touches the subject of balance because, having a lot of options is nice, but at the same time, you don't want players getting bogged down in a deluge of customizations, which is also difficult for the developers to balance. I think I'm not mistaken if I say this was one of the weakest points of the original, which is the balance. I won't go into much detail, but the build options for the priests made it virtually impossible to find a good balance. As a result, the game could suddenly go from being very difficult at the beginning to virtually unbeatable once you unlocked certain gear and skills. Now, I spoke to the senior producer from Kasedo Games at Gamescom, and he explained that balancing will, of course, be an ongoing event, so even after the game launches, but that they were very much on top of creating a more streamlined experience, and the changes to some of these systems have definitely helped in doing so. But aside from improving what's already there, the game also expands beyond just the missions and RPG elements, because a new strategic layer has been added via the Warmap, where you can choose between missions. Now, for me personally, this map reminds me a lot of Dawn of War 2 in a positive way, and here you can see all the separate areas that you control. Now, in these areas, you can also construct buildings that generate requisition points, which also highlights the extended resource management part, which in turn ties into customizing and improving your troops, which require various resources. So in part 1, you only had Blackstone and that was it. But here there are different types, some being specifically needed by leaders to increase their abilities. So you'll notice a lot of changes between parts 1 and 2. Now the gameplay loop remains the same overall, but in terms of features, the game just seems to be expanding, but also give players more flexibility in terms of the experience they want to achieve during their playtime. Personally, I'm really looking forward to the details of customizing your units and the various builds being available for both factions, and experiencing the transition from a team of tech priests to a leader with a group of support units. I think it's pretty clear that this isn't a game where you just have one playthrough of a campaign once and then you're done with the entire game. I think the story, of course, if you do another playthrough, will remain the same. Written by Ben Counter, who is, by the way, a highly renowned author within the Warhammer 40K world of books. I have read multiple of his stories over the years and they have never disappointed, so I'm really looking forward to the game's story as well. But as you as you notice, it's quite easy to get sidetracked talking about Warhammer 40K, but trying to suppress the fanboy here, but getting back on track. The main gameplay options, such as the ability to play Necrons, the addition of the Warmap, and the difficulty settings allow for very increasing challenges. I guess those put together will ensure that you can easily replay this game from time to time without feeling like you're following the exact same pattern. That's at least something that's always bringing me back to these games, the different approaches that you have, of course, made possible by a strong foundation of gameplay mechanics. Now, I'll definitely keep following Mechanicus 2. These are my thoughts on the game so far. I'd love to hear yours, so drop them down in a comment. Subscribe to the channel. I've got more strategy and RPG content, and of course, Mechanicus 2 content also coming your way. Like the video if you've enjoyed it, and for now, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye, guys.